Chapter 24. Well, the aeroplanes were coming. The man in yellow was beside them. Neither had noted his coming. He was saying that the southwest wards were marching. "I never expected it so soon," he cried. "They have done wonders. You must send them a word to help them on their way." Graham stared at him absent-mindedly. Then with a start he returned to his previous preoccupation about the flying stages. "Yes," he said. "That is good, that is good." He weighed a message. "Tell them, well done, Southwest." He turned his eyes to Helen Wotton again. His face expressed his struggle between conflicting ideas. "We must capture the flying stages," he explained. "Unless we can do that, they will land Negroes. At all costs we must prevent that." He felt even as he spoke that this was not what had been in his mind before the interruption. He saw a touch of surprise in her eyes. She seemed about to speak and a shrill bell drowned her voice. It occurred to Graham that she expected him to lead these marching people, that was the thing he had to do. He made the offer abruptly. He addressed the man in yellow, but he spoke to her. He saw her face respond. "Here I am doing nothing," he said. "It is impossible," protested the man in yellow. "It is a fight and a warren. Your place is here." He explained elaborately. He motioned towards the room where Graham must wait. He insisted no other course was possible. "We must know where you are," he said. "At any moment a crisis may arise needing your presence and decision." A picture had drifted through his mind of such a vast dramatic struggle as the masses in the ruins had suggested. But here was no spectacular battlefield such as he imagined. Instead was seclusion and suspense. It was only as the afternoon wore on that he pieced together a truer picture of the fight that was raging. Inaudibly and invisibly, within 4 miles of him, beneath the Roehampton stage. A strange and unprecedented contest it was. A battle that was 100,000 little battles. A battle in a sponge of ways and channels, fought out of sight of sky or sun under the electric glare. Fought out in a vast confusion by multitudes untrained in arms. Led chiefly by acclamation. Multitudes dulled by mindless labour, and enervated by the tradition of 200 years of servile security against multitudes demoralized by lives of venial differentiation into this force or that. The only weapon on either side was a little green metal carbine, whose secret manufacture and sudden distribution in enormous quantities had been one of Ostrog's culminating moves against the Council. Few had any experience with this weapon. Many had never discharged one. Many who carried it came unprovided with ammunition. Never was a wilder firing in the history of warfare. It was a battle of amateurs, armed rioters swept forward by the words and fury of a song, by the tramping sympathy of their numbers, pouring in countless myriads toward the smaller ways, the disabled lifts, the galleries slippery with blood, the halls and passages choked with smoke, beneath the flying stages, to learn there, when retreat was hopeless, the ancient mysteries of warfare. And overhead, save for a few sharpshooters upon the roof spaces and for a few bands and threads of vapor that multiplied and darkened toward the evening, the day was a clear serenity. Ostrog, it seems, had no bombs at command, and in all the earlier phases of the battle the flying machines played no part. Not the smallest cloud was there to break the empty brilliance of the sky. It seemed as though it held itself vacant until the aeroplanes should come. Ever and again there was news of these drawing nearer, from this Spanish town and then that, and presently from France. But of the new guns that Ostrog had made, and which were known to be in the city, came no news in spite of Graham's urgency, nor any report of successes from the dense felt of fighting strands about the flying stages. Section after section of the labour societies reported itself assembled, reported itself marching, and vanished from knowledge into the labyrinth of that warfare. What was happening there? Even the busy ward leaders did not know. In spite of the opening and closing of doors, the hasty messengers, the ringing of bells and perpetual clitter-clack of reporting implements, Graham felt isolated, strangely inactive, inoperative. His isolation seemed at times the strangest, the most unexpected of all the things that had happened since his awakening. It had something of the quality of that inactivity that comes in dreams. A tumult, the stupendous realization of a world struggle between Ostrog and himself, and then this confined little room, with its mouthpieces and bells and broken mirror. Now the door would be closed and Graham and Helen were alone together. They seemed sharply marked off then from all the unprecedented world storm that rushed together without, vividly aware of one another, only concerned with one another. Then the door would open again, messengers would enter, or a sharp bell would stab their quiet privacy, and it was like a window in a well-built, brightly lit house flung open suddenly to a hurricane. The dark hurry and tumult, the stress and vehemence of the battle rushed in and overwhelmed them. They were no longer persons but mere spectators, mere impressions of a tremendous convulsion. They became unreal even to themselves, miniatures of personality, indescribably small, and the two antagonistic realities, the only realities in being, were first the city, that throbbed and roared yonder in a belated frenzy of defense, and secondly the aeroplanes, hurling inexorably towards them, over the round shoulder of the world. There came a sudden stir outside, a running to and fro, and cries. The girl stood up speechless, incredulous. Metallic voices were shouting victory! Yes, it was victory! Bursting through the curtains appeared the man in yellow, startled and dishevelled with excitement. Victory! He cried. Victory! The people are winning! Ostrog's people have collapsed! She rose. Victory? What do you mean? Asked Graham. Tell me, what? We have driven them out of the under galleries at Norwood. Streatham is afire and burning wildly, and Roehampton is ours. Ours! And we have taken the monoplane that lay thereon. A shrill bell rang. An agitated, grey-headed man appeared from the room of the ward leaders. It is all over, he cried. What matters it now that we have Roehampton? The aeroplanes have been sighted at Boulogne. The Channel, said the man in yellow. He calculated swiftly. Half an hour. They still have 3 of the flying stages, said the old man. Those guns? Cried Graham. We cannot mount them in half an hour. Do you mean they are found? Too late, said the old man. If we could stop them another hour, cried the man in yellow. Nothing can stop them now, said the old man. They have near 100 aeroplanes in the first fleet. Another hour? To be so near, said the ward leader. Now that we have found those guns, to be so near. If once we could get them out upon the roof spaces. How long would that take? Asked Graham suddenly. An hour, certainly. Too late, cried the ward leader. Too late. Is it too late? Said Graham. Even now. An hour. He had suddenly perceived a possibility. He tried to speak calmly, but his face was white. There is a chance. You said there was a monoplane. On the Roehampton stage, sire. Smashed? No, it is lying crossways to the carrier. It might be got upon the guides, easily. But there is no aeronaut. Graham glanced at the 2 men and then at Helen. He spoke after a long pause. We have no aeronauts? None. He turned suddenly to Helen. His decision was made. I must do it. Do what? Go to this flying stage, to this machine. What do you mean? I am an aeronaut. After all, those days for which you reproached me were not altogether wasted. He turned to the old man in yellow. Tell them to put it upon the guides. The man in yellow hesitated. What do you mean to do? Cried Helen. This monoplane. It is a chance. You don't mean to fight. Yes, to fight in the air. I have thought before. A big aeroplane is a clumsy thing. A resolute man. But never since flying began, cried the man in yellow. There has been no need. But now the time has come. Tell them now, send them my message, to put it upon the guides. I see now something to do. I see now why I am here. The old man dumbly interrogated the man in yellow, nodded, and hurried out. Helen made a step towards Graham. Her face was white. But sire, how can one fight? You will be killed. Perhaps. Yet not to do it, or to let someone else attempt it. You will be killed, she repeated. I've said my word. Do you not see? It may save London. He stopped. He could speak no more. He swept the alternative aside by a gesture, and they stood looking at one another. They were both clear that he must go. There was no step back from these towering heroisms. Her eyes brimmed with tears. She came towards him with a curious movement of her hands, as though she felt her way and could not see. She seized his hand and kissed it. To wake, she cried, for this! He held her clumsily for a moment, and kissed the hair of her bowed head, and then thrust her away, and turned toward the man in yellow. He could not speak. The gesture of his arm said onward.
Chapter 25. The Coming of the Aeroplanes. 2 men in pale blue were lying in the irregular line that stretched along the edge of the captured Roehampton stage from end to end, grasping their carbines and peering into the shadows of the stage called Wimbledon Park. Now and then they spoke to one another. They spoke the mutilated English of their class and period. The fire of the Ostrogites had dwindled and ceased, and few of the enemy had been seen for some time. But the echoes of the fight that was going on now far below in the lower galleries of that stage came every now and then between the staccato of shots from the popular side. One of these men was describing to the other how he had seen a man down below there dodge behind the girder, and had aimed at a guess and hit him cleanly as he dodged too far. "He's down there still," said the marksman. "See that little patch? Yes, between those bars." A few yards behind them lay a dead stranger, face upwards to the sky, with the blue canvas of his jacket smouldering in a circle about the neat bullet hole in his chest. Close behind him a wounded man, with a leg swathed about, sat with an expressionless face and watched the progress of that burning. Behind them, athwart the carrier, lay the captured monoplane. "I can't see him now," said the second man in a tone of provocation. The marksman became foul-mouthed and high-voiced in his earnest endeavor to make things plain, and suddenly, interrupting him, came a noisy shouting from the sub-stage. "What's going on now?" he said, and raised himself on one arm to survey the stairheads in the central groove of the stage. A number of blue figures were coming up these and swarming across the stage. "We don't want all these fools," said his friend. "They only crowd up and spoil shots. What are they after?" "Shh! They're shouting something." The two men listened. The newcomers had crowded densely about the machine. 3 ward leaders, conspicuous by their black mantles and badges, clambered into the body and appeared above it. The rank and file flung themselves upon the vans, gripping hold of the edges, until the entire outline of the thing was manned, in some places 3 deep. One of the marksmen knelt up. "They're getting it on the carrier. That's what they're after." He rose to his feet. His friend rose also. "What's the good?" said his friend. "We've got no aeronauts." "That's what they're doing, anyhow." He looked at his rifle, looked at the struggling crowd, and suddenly turned to the wounded man. "Mind these, mate," he said, handing his carbine and cartridge belt, and in a moment he was running towards the monoplane. For a quarter of an hour he was lugging, thrusting, shouting, and heeding shouts. And then the thing was done, and he stood with a multitude of others cheering their own achievement. By this time he knew, what indeed everyone in the city knew, that the master, raw learner though he was, intended to fly this machine himself, was coming even now to take control of it, would let no other man attempt it. He who takes the greatest danger, he who bears the heaviest burden, that man is king. So the master was reported to have spoken. And even as this man cheered, and while the beads of sweat still chased one another from the disorder of his hair, he heard the thunder of a great tumult, and in fitful snatches the beat and impulse of the revolutionary song. He saw through a gap in the people that a thick stream of heads still poured up the stairway. "The master is coming!" shouted voices. "The master is coming!" And the crowd about him grew denser and denser. He began to thrust himself towards the central groove. "The master is coming! The sleeper! The master! God and the master!" roared the voices. And suddenly, quite close to him, were the black uniforms of the Revolutionary Guard, and for the first and last time in his life he saw Graham, saw him quite nearly. A tall, dark man in a flowing black robe he was, with a white, resolute face and eyes fixed steadfastly before him. A man, for all the little things about him, had neither ears nor eyes nor thoughts. For all his days that man remembered the passing of Graham's bloodless face. In a moment it had gone, and he was fighting in the swaying crowd. A lad, weeping with terror, thrust against him, pressing towards the stairways, yelling, "Clear for the start, you fools!" The bell that cleared the flying stage became a loud, unmelodious clanging. With that clanging in his ears, Graham drew near the monoplane, marched into the shadow of its tilting wing. He became aware that a number of people about him were offering to accompany him, and waved their offers aside. He wanted to think how one started the engine. The bell clanged faster and faster, and the feet of the retreating people roared faster and louder. The man in yellow was assisting him to mount through the ribs of the body. He clambered into the aeronaut's place, fixing himself very carefully and deliberately. What was it? The man in yellow was pointing to 2 small flying machines driving upward in the southern sky. No doubt they were looking for the coming aeroplanes. That, presently, the thing to do now was to start. Things were being shouted at him, questions, warnings. They bothered him. He wanted to think about the machine, to recall every item of his previous experience. He waved the people from him, saw the man in yellow dropping off through the ribs, saw the crowd cleft down the line of the girders by his gesture. For a moment he was motionless, staring at the levers, the wheel by which the engine shifted, and all the delicate appliances of which he knew so little. His eye caught a spirit level with the bubble towards him, and he remembered something, spent a dozen seconds in swinging the engine forward until the bubble floated in the center of the tube. He noted that the people were not shouting, knew they watched his deliberations. A bullet smashed on the bar above his head. Who fired? Was the line clear of people? He stood up to see, and sat down again. In another second the propeller was spinning and he was rushing down the guides. He gripped the wheel and swung the engine back to lift the stem. Then it was the people shouted. In a moment he was throbbing with the quiver of the engine, and the shouts dwindled swiftly behind, rushed down to silence. The wind whistled over the edges of the screen, and the world sank away from him very swiftly. Throb, throb, throb. Throb, throb, throb. Up he drove. He fancied himself free of all excitement, felt cool and deliberate. He lifted the stem still more, opened one valve on his left wing and swept round and up. He looked down with a steady head, and up. One of the Ostrogite monoplanes was driving across his course, so that he drove obliquely towards it and would pass below it at a steep angle. Its little aeronauts were peering down at him. What did they mean to do? His mind became action. One he saw held a weapon pointing, seemed prepared to fire. What did they think he meant to do? In a moment he understood their tactics, and his resolution was taken. His momentary lethargy was past. He opened 2 more valves to his left, swung round, and on to this hostile machine, closed his valves and shot straight at it, stem and windscreen shielding him from the shot. They tilted a little as if to clear him. He flung up his stem. Throb, throb, throb. Pause. Throb, throb. He set his teeth, his face into an involuntary grimace. And crash! He struck it. He struck upward beneath the nearer wing. Very slowly the wing of his antagonist seemed to broaden as if the impetus of his blow turned it up. He saw the full breadth of it, and then it slid downward out of his sight. He felt his stem going down. His hands tightened on the levers, whirled and rammed the engine back. He felt the jerk of a clearance. The nose of the machine jerked upward steeply, and for a moment he seemed to be lying on his back. The machine was reeling and staggering. It seemed to be dancing on its screw. He made a huge effort, hung for a moment on the levers, and slowly the engine came forward again. He was driving upward, but no longer so steeply. He gasped for a moment and flung himself at the levers again. The wind whistled about him. One further effort and he was almost level. He could breathe. He turned his head for the first time to see what had become of his antagonist. Turned back to the levers for a moment and looked again. For a moment he could have believed they were annihilated. And then he saw between the 2 stages to the east was a chasm. And down this something, a slender edge, fell swiftly and vanished, as a sixpence falls down a crack. At first he did not understand, and then a wild joy possessed him. He shouted at the top of his voice, an inarticulate shout, and drove higher and higher up the sky. Throb, throb, throb. Pause. Throb, throb, throb. Where was the other, he thought. They too. As he looked round the empty heavens he had a momentary fear that this second machine had risen above him, and then he saw it alighting on the Norwood stage. They had meant shooting. To risk being rammed headlong 2,000 feet in the air was beyond their latter-day courage. For a little while he circled, then swooped on a steep descent towards the westward stage. Throb, throb, throb. Throb, throb, throb. The twilight was creeping on apace. The smoke from the street stage that had been so dense and dark was now a pillar of fire, and all the laced curves of the moving ways and the translucent roofs and domes and the chasms between the buildings were glowing softly now, lit by the tempered radiance of the electric light that the glare of the day overpowered. The 3 efficient stages that the Ostrogites held, for Wimbledon Park was useless because of the fire from Roehampton, and Streatham was a furnace, were glowing with guide lights for the coming aeroplanes. As he swept over the Roehampton stage, he saw the dark masses of the people thereon. He heard a clap of frantic cheering, heard a bullet from the Wimbledon Park stage tweet through the air, and went beating up above the Surrey waste. He felt a breath of wind from the southwest, and lifted his westward wing as he had learned to do, and so drove upward, heeling into the rare, swift upper air. Whir, whir, whir. Up he drove and up, to that pulsing rhythm, until the country beneath was blue and indistinct, and London spread like a little map traced in light, like the mere model of a city near the brim of the horizon. The southwest was a sky of sapphire over the shadowy rim of the world, and ever as he drove upward the multitude of stars increased. And behold, in the southward, low down and glittering swiftly near, were 2 patches of nebulous light, and then 2 more, and then a glow of swiftly driving shapes. Presently he could count them. There were 24. The first fleet of aeroplanes had come. Beyond appeared yet a greater glow. He swept round in a half circle, staring at this advancing fleet. It flew in a wedge-like shape, a triangular flight of gigantic phosphorescent shapes sweeping nearer through the lower air. He made a swift calculation of their pace, and spun the little wheel that brought the engine forward. He touched a lever, and the throbbing effort of the engine ceased. He began to fall, fell swifter and swifter. He aimed at the apex of the wedge. He dropped like a stone through the whistling air. It seemed scarce a second from that soaring moment before he struck the foremost aeroplane. No man of all that black multitude saw the coming of his fate. No man among them dreamt of the hawk that struck downward upon them out of the sky. Those who were not limp in the agonies of air sickness were craning their black necks and staring to see the filmy city that was rising out of the haze, the rich and splendid city to which Massa Boss had brought their obedient muscles. Bright teeth gleamed, and the glossy faces shone. They had heard of Paris. They knew they were to have lordly times among the poor white trash. Suddenly, Graham hit them. He had aimed at the body of the aeroplane, but at the very last instant a better idea had flashed into his mind. He twisted about and struck near the edge of the starboard wing with all his accumulated weight. He was jerked back as he struck. His prow went gliding across its smooth expanse towards the rim. He felt the forward rush of the huge fabric sweeping him and his monoplane along with it, and for a moment that seemed an age he could not tell what was happening. He heard 1,000 throats yelling, and perceived that his machine was balanced on the edge of the gigantic float, and driving down, down. Glanced over his shoulder and saw the backbone of the aeroplane in the opposite float swaying up. He had a vision through the ribs of the sliding chairs, staring faces and hands clutching at the tilting guide bars. The fenestrations in the further float flashed upon as the aeronaut tried to right her. Beyond he saw a second aeroplane leaping steeply to escape the whirl of its heeling fellow. The broad area of swaying wings seemed to jerk upward. He felt he had dropped clear, that the monstrous fabric clean upturned hung like a sloping wall above him. He did not clearly understand that he had struck the side float of the aeroplane and slipped off, but he perceived that he was flying free on the downglide and rapidly nearing Earth. What had he done? His heart throbbed like a noisy engine in his throat, and for a perilous instant he could not move his levers because of the paralysis of his hands. He wrenched the levers to throw his engine back, fought for 2 seconds against the weight of it, felt himself righting, driving horizontally, set the engine beating again. He looked upward and saw 2 aeroplanes glide shouting far overhead. Looked back and saw the main body of the fleet opening out and rushing upward and outward. Saw the one he had struck fall edgewise on and strike like a giant knife blade along the wind wheels below it. He put down his stern and looked again. He drove up heedless of his direction as he watched. He saw the wind vanes give, saw the huge fabric strike the earth, saw its downward vanes crumble with the weight of its descent, and then the whole mass turned over and smashed upside down upon the sloping wheels. Then from the heaving wreckage a thin tongue of white fire licked up towards the zenith. He was aware of a huge mass flying through the air towards him, and turned upwards just in time to escape the charge, if it was a charge, of a second aeroplane. It whirled by below, sucked him down a fathom, and nearly turned him over in the gust of its close passage. He became aware of 3 others rushing towards him, aware of the urgent necessity of beating above them. Aeroplanes were all about him, circling wildly to avoid him as it seemed. They drove past him, above, below, eastward and westward. Far away to the westward was the sound of a collision, and 2 falling flares. Far away to the southward a second squadron was coming. Steadily he beat upward. Presently all the aeroplanes were below him, but for a moment he doubted the height he had of them, and did not swoop again. And then he came down upon a second victim, and all its load of soldiers saw him coming. The big machine heeled and swayed as the fear-maddened men scrambled to the stern for their weapons. A score of bullets sung through the air, and there flashed a star in the thick glass windshield that protected him. The aeroplane slowed and dropped to foil his stroke, and dropped too low. Just in time he saw the windwheels of Bromley Hill rushing up towards him, and spun about and up as the aeroplane he had chased crashed among them. All its voices wove into a felt of yelling. The great fabric seemed to be standing on end for a second among the heeling and splintering vans, and then it flew to pieces. Huge splinters came flying through the air. Its engines burst like shells. A hot rush of flame shot overhead into the darkling sky. "Two!" he cried, with a bomb from overhead bursting as it fell, and forthwith he was beating up again. A glorious exhilaration possessed him now, a giant activity. His troubles about humanity, about his inadequacy, were gone forever. He was a man in battle rejoicing in his power. Aeroplanes seemed radiating from him in every direction, intent only on avoiding him. The yelling of their packed passengers came in short gusts as they swept by. He chose his third quarry, struck hastily and did but turn it on edge. It escaped him, to smash against the tall cliff of London Wall. Flying from that impact he skimmed the darkling ground so nearly he could see a frightened rabbit bolting up a slope. He jerked up steeply, and found himself driving over South London with the air about him vacant. To the right of him a wild riot of signal rockets from the Ostrogites banged tumultuously in the sky. To the south the wreckage of half a dozen airships flamed, and east and west and north they fled before him. They drove away to the east and north, and went about in the south, for they could not pause in the air. In their present confusion, any attempt at evolution would have meant disastrous collisions. He passed 200 feet or so above the Roehampton stage. It was black with people and noisy with their frantic shouting. But why was the Wimbledon Park stage black and cheering too? The smoke and flame of Streatham now hid the 3 further stages. He curved about and rose to see them in the northern quarters. First came the square masses of Shooter's Hill into sight, from behind the smoke, lit and orderly with the aeroplane that had landed and its disembarking negroes. Then came Blackheath, and then under the corner of the reek the northward stage. On Blackheath no aeroplane had landed. Norwood was covered by a swarm of little figures running to and fro in a passionate confusion. Why? Abruptly he understood. The stubborn defense of the flying stages was over. The people were pouring into the underways of these last strongholds of Ostrogoth's usurpation. And then, from far away on the northern border of the city, full of glorious import to them, came a sound, a signal, a note of triumph, the leaden thud of a gun. His lips fell apart, his face was disturbed with emotion. He drew an immense breath. "They win!" he shouted to the empty air. "The people win!" The sound of a second gun came like an answer, and then he saw the monoplane on Blackheath was running down its guides to launch. It lifted clean and rose. It shot up into the air, driving straight southward and away from him. In an instant it came to him what this meant. It must needs be Ostrog in flight. He shouted and dropped towards it. He had the momentum of his elevation, and fell slanting down the air and very swiftly. It rose steeply at his approach. He allowed for its velocity and drove straight upon it. It suddenly became a mere flat edge, and behold, he was past it, and driving headlong down with all the force of his futile blow. He was furiously angry. He reeled the engine back along its shaft and went circling up. He saw Ostrog's machine beating up a spiral before him. He rose straight towards it, one above it by virtue of the impetus of his swoop and by the advantage and weight of a man. He dropped headlong, dropped, and missed again. As he rushed past, he saw the face of Ostrog's aeronaut confident and cool, and in Ostrog's attitude a wincing resolution. Ostrog was looking steadfastly away from him, to the south. He realized with a gleam of wrath how bungling his flight must be. Below he saw the Croydon hills. He jerked upward, and once more he gained on his enemy. He glanced over his shoulder, and his attention was arrested. The eastward stage, the one on Shooter's Hill, appeared to lift. A flash changing to a tall grey shape, a cowled figure of smoke and dust, jerked into the air. For a moment this cowled figure stood motionless, dropping huge masses of metal from its shoulders, and then it began to uncoil a dense head of smoke. The people had blown it up, aeroplane and all. As suddenly, a second flash and grey shape sprang up from the Norwood stage, and even as he stared at this came a dead report, and the air wave of the first explosion struck him. He was flung up and sideways. For a moment his monoplane fell nearly edgewise with her nose down, and seemed to hesitate whether to overset altogether. He stood on his windshield, wrenching the wheel that swayed up over his head, and then the shock of the second explosion took his machine sideways. He found himself clinging to one of the ribs of his machine, and the air was blowing past him and upward. He seemed to be hanging quite still in the air, with the wind blowing past him. It occurred to him that he was falling. Then he was sure that he was falling. He could not look down. He found himself recapitulating with incredible swiftness all that had happened since his awakening, the days of doubt, the days of empire, and at last the tumultuous discovery of Ostrog's calculated treachery. The vision had a quality of utter unreality. Who was he? Why was he holding so tightly with his hands? Why could he not let go? In such a fall as this, countless dreams have ended. But in a moment he would wake. His thoughts ran swifter and swifter. He wondered if he should see Helen again. It seemed so unreasonable that he should not see her again. It must be a dream, yet surely he would meet her. She at least was real. She was real. He would wake and meet her. Although he could not look at it, he was suddenly aware that the earth was very near the end. End of Chapter 25. End of The Sleeper Awakes by H.G. Wells. Recorded by James Christopher, jxchristopher@yahoo.com. In Phoenix, Arizona, September 2008.